Шановні колеги, друзі, студенти, гості Київського національного університету імені Тараса Шевченка. Відповідно, ми відкриваємо сьогоднішню сесію презентацією наших колег. Тут присутній Kuijt, університет Нотр-Дам, штат Індіана, USA. І я попрошу піднятись. Please, William, stand up. Stand up, yes, okay. And професор Вільям Донарума. Якщо Kuijt, він представляє департамент антропології, то Вільям Донарума представляє департамент фільму, телебачення та театру. Це поєднання не дивне, тому що основне завдання цих двох професорів з Америки це не читання лекцій насправді, а вони вже тут третій раз, і основне завдання вони вбачають своє, ну скажімо, фільмування, запис в першу чергу тих деструкцій, які спричиняє російсько-українська війна по відношенню до культурної спадщини, до пам'яток культурної спадщини. Вже третій раз вони приїжджають сюди в Україну, і разом з співробітниками кафедри ми їздимо по територіях Житомирщини, Київщини, Чернігівщини разом з співробітниками Інституту археології Національної академії наук. І відповідно це основна місія їхня, тому що вони бажають зробити видимими і показати світу ті руйнації, яка спричиняє ця жахлива війна. Але окрім цього, вони несуть і певний меседж з собою, тому що він працював як археолог в різних точках, причому це зазвичай гарячі точки. Він працював на Близькому Сході, він працював в Грузії, тепер він займається фільмуванням, записом пам'яток і руйнацій на теренах України. І сьогоднішня лекція його буде корисна всім нам. Чому? Тому що ми дещо зголодніли по науковій, академічній саме частині археології. До нас значно менше стало приїжджати спеціалістів за кордону з зрозумілих причин. Насправді багатьом університетським співробітникам просто забороняють приїжджати. Це я знаю по своїм колегам, які з інших країн. В останній раз, коли він робив презентацію по збереженню культурної спадщини минулого року в нашому університеті, він попередив, що він виступав не в якості співробітника університету Нотр-Дам, а в якості вільної людини, яка на волонтерських власних засадах приїхала в Київ і проводить лекцію, тому що тоді, в той час, йому університет, не те, що заборонив, а не рекомендував прибувати в Київ. І я знаю, що в цей раз їм довелось пройти багато бюрократичних перепон, щоб отримати дозвіл побувати в Києві і після цієї лекції, і після нашої дискусії поїхати знову ж таки по постраждалим регіонам Житомирщини, Київщини і Чернігівщини. Тому я з радістю вітаю нашого колегу Kuijta, який як академічний вчений, як спеціаліст в неоліті, працював з різними пам'ятками неолітичного Близького Сходу. І я знаю, що він працював в Чаталг'юті. А сьогоднішня презентація буде присвячена відомій пам'ятці, з чого ми починаємо наш неоліт, тому що, безумовно, європейський неоліт, він пов'язаний з культурами Близького Сходу. Починаємо ми лекції наші з такої пам'ятки, як Єрихон, Телес-Султан, це класика до керамічного неоліту. І, зрозуміло, ми б хотіли побачити нам уявлення професора, який був дотичний до цих досліджень. Відповідно, тематика називається презентації I live, I die, I live again. 10,000 years old ritual heirlooms and the life history of Near Eastern Neolithic plastered skulls. Відповідно, лекція у нас буде англійською, тому що в нашому закладі, в університеті, англійська – це друга державна мова. Please, yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here to visit with you. I have to start by giving you many apologies. The first apology I have to give to you is that I don't speak Ukrainian. So you have my apologies. I've tried to use a lot of photographs and words that will be clear. So my hope is that for all of you, it will work all right and we'll be able to follow through this. The second apology that I give to you is on behalf of my colleague Bill and myself, and that is we are so sorry about what is taking place in the United States. And in terms of this man whose last name starts with the letter T, just like other names that might start with the letter P, we're not going to mention his name because we're deeply disappointed about what is taking place. We are, to be honest, somewhat ashamed about what is taking place. So our deepest apologies for that. We didn't have any control over it, but our apologies for that. Okay, today I want to tell you a story, and it's a story that is not a normal one. It is about, in some ways, about understanding the past through one particular place, and that is thinking about the Neolithic of the ancient Near East, of places like Jordan and Syria, and thinking about it in the context of trying to understand how we can think about a place in the past and how we were able, and how humans in the past were able to deal with death, and were able to think about how community and how identity were created together. This is work that I've been doing for many years, some of which I've published before, but some of which is very new tonight, or this afternoon, I should say. So I want to show you some of this because it is, I think, a very interesting story that's not very complicated, but is very insightful to try and understand places in the past. Before I start, is there a chance to turn the lights down a little bit? Because that's even better. Okay, now hopefully you won't all go to sleep, but if you do, that's fine by me. So let me start by getting this so that we can just advance it as we go. So the story I want to tell you is about when people first started to settle down, to domesticate plants and animals, to build houses, and that we think of this as a story starting at about 10,000 years ago, as people started to domesticate themselves, because that's what the Neolithic is all about. It's about when we as humans stopped moving around the landscape and started to live in one place. And that changed everything, absolutely everything. It doesn't matter what area of the world you talk about. The transition to the Neolithic is one of perhaps the most important change that humanity has ever had. The context that I want to explain today is not the Neolithic of Europe or of France or Ukraine, but I want to look at here, thinking about the Neolithic of the Near East. These are some of the sites. This is, of course, an archaeology that has been, there's been a lot of activity, especially since the 1950s onwards. I want to give you some very specific examples of how this work is now fundamentally changing how we think about humans in the past. So we're going to look at this, and we're going to look strangely. We're going to spend most of this time thinking about a story related to one human skull, because it's something that this new work that we're doing is going to help us understand. The skull that you're going to be looking at is called Jericho D117. It was found in the excavations of Jericho by Kathleen Kenyon in 1953. And what she found, to the surprise of everybody, because nobody had discovered this before, is that she found a group of skulls where, as you can see here, here's two examples of it, where she found a group of skulls where people had taken clay and they put it over the cheeks they put it over the mouth, the ears, they would put shells over the eyes, and they would create a human face. So it's essentially creating life on a skull of a deceased individual. It's recreating life. It's not just makeup. It's like creating an entirely new face with noses and ears. And as you can see here, they're very beautiful. I think they're very beautiful. They're absolutely extraordinary, the amount of work that went into making these. Here's the part that, as background, before we go into the skulls, just to give you some of this. So when we think about what were villages like, what was Jericho like as a representative village at 10,000 years ago? And that is, these are fairly substantial. They're about 2 to 2.5 hectares, the largest ones. They are in places 5 to 8 meters deep in terms of the depth of buildings. And there's a number of different aspects to this. First of all, probably they were lived in by 100 to 500 people. It's the first time you have agriculture with domestication of animals and plants at the same time. It's also that point under which people started to build structures. At this point, they started to build circular and then rectangular structures. The structures, the shape of the structures doesn't matter. What matters is that they're building structures and they're living in the same buildings. It means that they're invested in that place. It means that they want to maintain that place. So they're no longer moving around this landscape. They're living in one place. There's some other parts to this, including people started to store their own food as well. So not only were they harvesting food, but they could store food. So they started to develop ways of getting some security in terms of their food. The last part to it is that they went and they started to bury their people, their family members, in the settlement where they lived. So it wasn't a matter of just burying them somewhere else, but they started to do it in such a way where they were not only creating homes, but they were creating villages with people being buried inside of the spaces where people lived. This is very different from what took place before. What we now know is that what Kathleen Kenyon found, she found, if I remember correctly, 12 skulls at Jericho. But now we've seen that there are many archaeology sites that have plastered skulls. This is one of the most famous. This is at Tel Aswad in Syria, where they found 25 of these skulls. And these skulls are not just, like one in one house, one in the other house, etc. They are found together in the same buildings. So it's not quite the level that you're making a temple or that you're making a church or something else, but you're making a building of ancestry and a building of memory. And so they were burying them together in the same place. This is a good photograph when you think about this. When I say they're quite beautiful, I think there's other words. The other words that have been used to describe these. I will often show this photograph to some of my students, and I'll say, what word would you use to describe these photographs? And they will say, sleeping, peaceful, silent is another word they often use. Content. These are not the faces of individuals who are in trouble. From my standpoint, these are the faces of people who are content with the world. They also make one other observation, and that is they all look similar to each other. Now, if you look around the room at the person sitting to your right, go ahead, go on. Look to the person to your right, look to the left, and you will realize their face looks different from yours. I have a big mandible. I have a nose. I have cheekbones, but mine are different from yours or from yours. Some of us have bigger skulls. Some of us have protuberances. Some of us has great hair. There's all kinds of variation in the human faces that we see. What's interesting is that they were making fantastic faces with very detailed elaboration, but they chose to make them look the same. That's something that's really interesting. So let me just continue on with this to explain some of the different pieces. So one of the things that's extraordinary is that what they would do is after they buried their relatives, they would wait until the flesh was gone, and they would come back and remove the crania. They would remove the skull. And then they would place these skulls together in groups. In some cases, about 1% of all the skulls, they would put this makeup on with the clay. They would put the eyes, they would make noses, they would do this. But only about 1%. So if it was this room, maybe there would be 2 of us that would have our skulls plastered. The question behind this, of course, is whose skulls do you plaster? Is it a matter that it's a very important woman in the village? Is it that it's the oldest grandfather who was a great hunter? Is it that there's somebody who is very rich? Why those 2 individuals? It's not chance. Nobody is flipping a coin to try and pick it out. They're doing it for a reason. We don't entirely know why. What's interesting is that the group of 9 skulls from Jericho, 7 of them are female, 2 are male. In other cases, it's maybe 60% female or 60% male and 40% female. So it's got nothing to do with being either male or female. We know that for sure at this point. It's a matter of that they're doing this probably because of the social status, the importance. Perhaps somebody is a great singer. Perhaps this is the prehistoric Silapak, the opera singer from Ukraine. Maybe there's some other reason. We don't entirely know, but it's very clear that there are reasons. Here's another view. This is skull D117. So to think about this as a story from one skull, and then to step back and ask the question, what have we learned from this? So let's go and look at this one skull first, and then we're going to start thinking in terms of what this all means. So here's the example of the skull, and you can see this one was excavated, by the way, by Kathleen Kenyon, and then donated to a museum in Sydney, Australia. And so I'm doing some work with, in 1954 it was donated. I'm doing some work with some colleagues, John Magnuson, and one other individual who I'm afraid I can't mention to you right now for reasons that I'll have to explain later. But doing work with 2 different individuals in terms of trying to understand with medical imaging and with other very, very specific scientific techniques to understand what's going on. So here's the one example that we're going to be looking at. You can see there's a nose. You can see there's a mandible. There's the lips. You can see the 2 ears. You can see the shells that are partially covered. And that's one of the important things here, is that this is not a matter of making it and then leaving it alone. Apparently, they've been making these and repainting them at different points. So think of it as, I don't know, you have a house that's 100 years old. And if you were to go and scrape the wall where it was painted, it may be that at one point the wall was yellow. Before, maybe it was brown and painted brown. Maybe it was blue. So they're adding layers and changing what's going on. If you look closely at the nose, you can see that some of the clay comes up around the corners of the nose here. So this is telling us something. It's telling us some really important things. So let's look a little further about what's going on with this so you can have an understanding. I need to give you just a little bit more background, and that is starting in the 1990s, several different researchers, colleagues of mine, have tried to use scientific medical imaging equipment to get thin sections of the cranium and to look at it. So these are showing you different views where they've looked at plastered crania to see what they look like. Now remember, all of these, with the exception of the Sloan example, all of these are using equipment that is 20 years old. That's huge. That's before the iPhone. Put it that way. This is not just a matter of iPhone 6 and then you're buying an iPhone 12. This is a matter of there was almost no iPhone and now you have an iPhone 12. That's the difference in terms of technology. So what we've done is we've now gone and used medical imaging that's used in medical practices to look at things like bone growth, bone density, ones under which you can do a lot of work to understand what's going on with the crania, but not do any damage to it. So there's huge value because it means you don't have to destroy it to understand it. So there's lots of good research that's taken place. This shows you some of what we're starting to understand, and that is that there's a series of steps. It's not a matter of basically what we now know is that they're using recipes for how to make these skulls. It's not a matter of a bunch of little kids taking clay and slapping it on, put some shell, maybe a little more. It's not that at all. Instead, what they're doing is they're doing it step after step after step after step. So there's a process, a very specific process. So this, we have to now start looking at it as if you're making a pot with ceramics, not that you're decorating a face. So we have to think about it in terms of technology. We have to think about it in terms of time, because you're taking something that's wet clay, you're putting it into certain places, you have to let it dry before you put your next layer on. So there's a whole series of steps that are involved in this. And so I want you to think about this. I don't know what your favorite pasta recipe is, or your favorite recipe for some complicated dish, but that is, if you change the recipe, sometimes it works out well, and other points, it does not work out well. It produces something that's very different. They had recipes, and I'm going to show you how we're starting to understand that. So here's part of the recipe. They have a series of steps. You can see up here where there's different steps involved in adding clay, removing the mandible, the jaw, adding clay in different locations. There's this whole series of little steps, sometimes that takes days before you can go to the next step. So this is much more complicated than one would think about. So the point I want to leave you with as we sort of think about this is that ultimately we need to approach this as a technical process. We have to think about this as, how do you take wet material like clay and dry it out in such a way where these hold together? Keep in mind, These are 10,000-year-old skulls. This clay has been on there, and it's stayed there for 10,000 years. There's no fire, there's no kiln. It's only a matter of taking it and drying it in the sun. And after 10,000 years, one excavates these and finds them. That's extraordinary. That's absolutely extraordinary. So they knew what they were doing. They understood very clearly how to do this. So let's look at this and sort of think about some of the different pieces that are involved. Here you can see the skull on the upper left. You can see one of the medical images on the upper right. Then you can see where we have gone and looked at, we've adjusted color. We've used color to highlight different materials. So this is one of the values of this particular medical imaging, is that we can use different color to show the different layers that are involved. Here's the scary part. Back in 1995, one of the first pieces of work with the iPhone 1, essentially, given it was 1991, they were able to document in one skull that there were 17 different layers. 17 different layers, and each of these layers had to be applied at a different point of time. So this is quite complicated. So let me just show you what some of this medical imaging will highlight for you. First of all, if you look up above here, you can see the first thing is that when they made the skulls, they removed the mandible. They took off all the jawbone and removed it. They also went in places and they removed all the teeth in the front. And then they created the new face. So in this example, D117, there's no mandible, there's no jaw, but they've made a new jaw. They've made it look like there is a jaw. So they've shortened the face. And that's really important. They don't care about the mandible. They don't want the mandible. But they do want to have the face. Now, if you look, you can see in the upper right, you can see some of the bone. You can see up there, you can see some of the dentition. That's the top dentition. And then this white area that should be the jaw, that's actually right here. So all of this is missing. All of that has been removed. You can also see with the different images, you can see some of the cranial bones, and you can see the material that's inside. This gives you a close-up looking at this one particular image. The red line shows you the view, the cross-section view through there. And what you can see here is that you can see that most of the dentition has been removed. So most of the dentition for the maxilla up above has been removed, with the exception of this tooth that is still intact. They've added this clay here. They've added a nose. They filled it in here. That little piece up there is a piece of shell. That's one of the shells for the eye. The other thing you'll notice is that these are different color. There's multiple different sections that have different color. Those all represent different density. So these are different layers. And what's great about it is that the different layers are made very differently from each other. So they're doing different things. So let me show you now how they're doing it. So you remember what I said about the face? It's all about the face. It has nothing to do with the mandible. This shows you right here, you can see the mandible is gone, the area gray in the center. But what they've done is they've now created a face that is shorter. It's been compressed. So you see the eyes have actually been moved upwards. Where the mouth goes, it's no longer here, it's slightly up. So they've shrunk down. They've shrunk that down so that the proportion is still there. It's just miniaturized in the front as you're looking at it. And this is what they do with most of them in different ways. The other part to it is that they're using color. They're using red and yellow. And the red is coming from basically iron oxide, ferrous. Sometimes it's used in paint and in other situations where you can use that to get a red color. So they're creating a flesh color for the skull itself. So there's an element of not only different layers, but they're also using color to their advantage. So they're doing a number of different things here. And then you can see the facial features. You can see the ear on the side. You can see the nose, all these different little pieces to show you how it fits together. Here's another example. One of the things that's extraordinary about this is that they are putting the clay in two different places. One on the outside of the skull, and the second one on the inside of the skull. And the only way you can do that is if you make a hole in the back. So if you think of where your vertebrae go, there's a hole that in English is called the foramen magnum. It's where the crania sits, the skull sits on your neck. What they're doing is they're taking that hole that's about this big and they're making it much bigger so you could put your fist into it. And that's because they want to add material from the inside. They want to pack, for example, with the nose, they want to put clay coming in this way, and they want to put clay coming in from the back, from the inside. So they're making these at the same time, clay on the outside and clay on the inside. But it's not the same clay. The clay on the inside is much coarser, and it has much more in the way of things like sand and bigger stones. The material on the outside is very fine. It's like a fine plaster. So there's different clays that are used in different ways. So let me just show you very quickly here some of the different pieces. So you can see they're packing from the inside right here. They're packing some material there. They're also packing in material underneath through the basically where the mouth is. They're also adding some in the cheeks. So here's the cheek area. If you were to feel here where your zygomatic is, your cheekbone, and that gap, they're packing that full of clay that's very specific. They're doing more clay on the outside, and you can see one of the layers that goes all the way along there. So they're doing a whole range of different things, and they're doing it in very specific order. This is a different skull, but it's from the same group of 9. This one's at the British Museum. In this case, they packed the entire skull with clay. This is as if you took a soccer ball, a football from, I don't know, Real Madrid. You stole one of their soccer balls and you packed it full of clay. And you can see here, you can see these different colors, these different densities. You can see there where they've packed it through the hole they've made in the back of the cranium. In this case, it's a very clever idea, because if you fill up this entire soccer ball, this crania, with clay, then you can put more material on the outside and it's not going to collapse. It's like making a balloon that is very strong now. So they've been very clever about how to do that. Here's another example of this, where you can see they're making these noses, they're making these different parts, they're adding color to it. One of the things that's extraordinary is we now know that they're making the nose and the ears separately. They're making them, they're putting them on the shelf, or they're putting them on the fire by the fire hearth, and they're letting them just dry. When those are ready, they're making the rest of the skull, they're adding particular clay, and then they're taking the dried parts and they're just pushing it into place. So they're making these different parts in advance. And that means you don't have to do it all on Sunday morning when you want to make your skull. Instead, you can make that nose and those ears, you can make that 2 months in advance. So you're now making parts, not just creating one thing. The other aspect to this, and we don't know the answer, is are they making more than one skull at a time? If you find, as an archaeologist, you find 9 skulls together, are they making the parts for all 9 of them and then sort of getting together, you know, over a beer or something else, beer or tea, and making these skulls? I think it's entirely possible. I think it's entirely possible that they're doing that in groups at different points of time. So here's how we've been trying to think about this. And this is going to be impossible for you to read, both because it's in technical English, because this is for a journal article that we're working on, but also because it's very small for you in the back. But let me explain what you're looking at. So here, you're looking at time, thinking about it hours at different points of time. And each one of these is a point under which drying is taking place. So you make something, you add a layer with clay, and then you let it sit and dry for a week, 2 weeks. It could easily be that. You let them dry, and then you add the next layer of clay. You let it dry. You add the next layer. You let it dry. You add the next layer. You let it dry. So this is not a matter of making the skull super quickly. It's a matter of you have to take your time and you have to understand how you're going to do that. The other part to it is that these different colors, green versus the sort of pink color here, these are steps that occur when you're putting clay on the inside of the crania. So it's a process. Step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We're trying to understand the recipe. We're trying to essentially take this pasta dish. This is like a cooking show for archaeologists. You're trying to take the pasta dish that you've excavated, and now you're saying, how did they make it? Was there tomatoes? Was there bacon? Was there pasta? But also, how long did you cook the pasta? How many tomatoes did you use as part of the recipe? So we're trying to think about this as a cooking process, not just making ceramics, but really as a cooking process. And I think what we've now uncovered is that they're doing at least 9 distinct steps to make this. And we've been trying to think about this in terms of everything from ingredients to that of the different technological steps that are involved. Here's another way to think about this. I get paid to write about, in some ways, I get paid to write about death, about the archaeology of death. It's one of the things that I've done over the years. Let me explain what I think is taking place here. And that is, at some point, you have the death of an individual. Then the next step is you have the burial. Then you have a point where people are coming back. And this is probably in the neighborhood of at least 10 years, because there needs to be the defleshing of the crania so that you can just remove the crania. So they have to wait. They have to wait for all the ants and all the insects to finish up their work. And once it's clean, then they can take the crania off. So that's another piece of time. Then at some point, they're taking the skull from the grave, removing the skull, and that's when they start making the new plaster skull. And they start doing that as a series of steps. The most interesting one is, the most interesting question from my standpoint is, why do this? Why do you want to spend the time decorating the skull of your aunt, your uncle, your grandmother, your grandfather? Why do you want to do this? In some ways, I think the answer is probably very simple. You want them to keep living. You're creating new life from a deceased individual. So that part is probably fairly simple. But then there's a question of, why are you going to invest so much time in doing this? You could just as easily be, I don't know, growing more apple trees or raising more goats or whatever you wanted to do, building a better house. But instead, because of the complexity of this, it probably means that you have people who are essentially they are the specialists to do this. These are the individuals who control ritual. These are the prehistoric priests or craftspeople who are making these skulls and doing it in such a way where they're investing energy, they're investing personality and history into these skulls. So there's a lot of different things going on here. Here's another part that's really interesting to this. In various publications, I've made the article that making these skulls is doing two things at the same time. One is that it's recognizing this is a known individual, because it's not an accident. It's not an accident that a particular skull is selected. People would have known whose skull that is. It just makes sense. You would know who that was. It was probably somebody who was named, and they understood that. But I think you can also turn it around and say that something else is happening, and that the something else is they're making the skulls look pretty similar to each other. So they're not taking somebody who has an incredibly big nose and making their big nose, and then recreating their big nose. They're not taking somebody's huge ears and adding the huge ears or big eyes or something else. Instead, they're kind of making them look all the same. They're sort of doing it in such a way where there is variation, but it's variation within a known group. It's one of those things that I'm told when you go to Ireland, you can go into any Irish bar and you can immediately spot who the American university students are. It's true. You can. You can do it in terms of haircut. You can do it in terms of how loud and rude they are. And you can do it because they all wear North Face clothing. And then they'll all have a water bottle with them that will say, I don't know, their university affiliation. So it's one of those things within 20 seconds, you can walk in, you can look around the bar and say, that's where the rude Americans are. Over here are the nice Canadians from the 51st state. I'm Canadian, by the way. You can sort of understand this very quickly. And that's what they're doing here, is they're using symbolism to create that in so many different ways. So let's think about it as a series of steps. And here I want to introduce a fundamental aspect to this. And the difference is between primary mortuary practice and secondary mortuary practice. Let me explain this to you. A primary mortuary practice, one that you're all familiar with, is where there is a death of some individual. And then over a period of time, well, actually, there's a first step. The first step is you're born. You're born over a period of years, hopefully many, many long years with lots of children and happiness. At some point, there is biological death. And then after some point, there's a form of celebration. You can call it a wake, you can call it a grieving, you can call it saying goodbye, but it's usually one that occurs within about a week at most. Depending on particular religions, it's maybe more. With particular religions, it's very quick. In some cases, it continues further on. Eventually, there's the burial, and that may take place in a matter of days. So I'm not worried about the amount of time. Think of it as a series of steps. But then the last step is, of course, the burial of the individual. And yes, there are still memorials and people still come back, but for all intents and purposes, the human skeleton is left alone. That's a primary mortuary practice. In the Neolithic, they're doing something very different. They're doing what we refer to as a secondary mortuary practice. It's one where the term is that you have, in English, the term is you have the socially sanctioned removal of parts or all of the individual. So it's one under which members of the community think it's okay to go and remove the crania after the flesh is gone and to do something with the crania. In this case, they'll do it in such a way where they will remove the skulls, they plaster them. There is some form of celebration, and then there's the reburial of the skulls. So that's a secondary process. There's a couple things that are really important about this. Rarely do we get to time when we die as humans. There's circumstance. We try and prolong it, but there's circumstance under which some things we can't control. And therefore, both the timing of death, but also the celebration, sometimes it's awkward. For agriculturalists, for people living in villages, if that happens during harvest season, as you're trying to take the crops from the field or the tree or the fruit from the trees, that's not a good time to take 3 days. You need to be able to work to get those things done. So there's only a limited number of people who can participate in that. On the other hand, if you're doing this where you remove the skulls and then you say, let's have a big party and give thanks to all of our relatives, all of the people we love, you can pick the day. And you can pick up the phone. They didn't have phones back then, but you can basically make arrangements for other people to come, other family members to come. You can say, let's do it on the 1st of December. And other people can come from other villages. So you can create this big event. And that's very important because that is the process of memorializing, of thinking about creating new memories and new experiences for people in a way that you can control it because you control the timing. Here's the other part to it, and this is why I'm quite sure this is how it's taking place, is that they're doing it where they're burying groups of them. It's not just individuals. It's in some cases, it's 9. It's many more. So they're doing this as a community event, as well as that of recognizing the individual. Here's another part to it, and that is that it turns out that at some points, they're burying these crania in groups of 3 or multiples of 3. In this particular case, you can see a group of 9 skulls, 3 of which are facing in one direction, set 2 is another group, and then set 3 is another group. So they're doing it in a way that is very planned. They're not just sort of randomly throwing the skulls into a pit. They're placing them in a very specific way. They're saying goodbye to them, and they're doing it in such a way where there's a very specific order to what they're doing. Here's another big question. How do you get a group of 9 skulls? How do you do that? I can only come up with so far with 2 real ways. One is that all 9 skulls come from one family. The other one is that there are 9 families who contribute 1 skull each. Now, you can do it in such a way where maybe it's 4 families and contributing 1 or 2 skulls each. But these are very different. If all the skulls are from one family, how long does it take to get 9 skulls from one family? It means you have to wait for your aunt, your uncle, your mother, your father. You have to wait for all of them to pass away. And then you have to wait, let's call it 10 years for each one of them for the flesh to decay so that you can then start doing your recipes and making those skulls. It means that you're not going to be around for this. It means that maybe every 100 years, a family would be able to have a major event. The second way to think about it is that they're contributing in such a way where instead of a mega event, instead, what's taking place, as you can see here, is that different houses are contributing some of these crania. So that it's a matter of the Donnarumma house contributes 1 skull. The Kaight household contributes another skull, et cetera, et cetera. That has very different implications. Unfortunately, we don't know the answer to that yet. Our hope is that there will be some ancient DNA research that will start to help us understand that. But at the moment, my bet is that it would be more than 1 family. It just makes sense. You want to have rituals like this occurring on a regular basis. And the best way to do that is that different families are contributing skulls on a regular basis. So that's an interesting question. We don't know the answer to it, but we're going to figure that out at some point as we continue on. I mentioned 2 different pasta recipes, and I think that's a good way to think about this because it's one that everybody who makes a pasta sauce. Bill and I took the night train from Lviv last night, and as part of that, one of the individuals we had dinner with had pasta bolognese, so the red sauce. I tasted it and I went, that's not the same red sauce my mother would make. It's not the same red sauce. Wait, I'm really stupid. I'm really stupid. I shouldn't have used pasta as an example. I should have said borscht. That is what I should have said for this audience. Because you immediately go, oh yeah, my mother's borscht or the borscht from my family in Odessa is different from the place in Lukashivka or whatever example you want to think of. And all of you and all of your families have the best borscht. It's, that's the way it always is, right? So I should have gone with that. Either way, the number of ingredients that you have in your pasta, red sauce, or your borscht, really, it's not a huge difference. There's the core element of tomatoes and beets. Maybe you're going to add meat. Maybe you're going to add potatoes. I don't know. There's some variation, but it's kind of the same. It's just a matter of you're doing it slightly different. The phrase that I want to introduce here, and it's borrowed from a really good researcher by the name of Richard Wilkie, is common differences. Common differences. It's understood when you make your soup, there's certain ingredients, but there's differences in terms of how you make it better for your family. There's ways where you do this. And I think what's going on with the skulls is kind of the same thing. They're doing something that's very similar to that in some different ways. So let me explain how. This is an illustration of skulls from 4 different archaeology sites. What you can see here is that they're all using clay over the face. But there are some differences here. You can see in the case on the lower left, there's actually shells that are being used for the eyes. In this example here, the eyes are totally closed. Most cases, the eyes are closed. This one actually has the mandible. This one does not. So my bet is that anybody from these villages would immediately recognize, oh, this is a bowl of borscht. This is a plastered skull face. But then they'd start looking at it and go, yeah, but my people in my village didn't make this one. This one's got chicken in the soup, and we don't use chicken. Or something similar to that. Because they're starting to think about this in a way where there is both a common practice, but also it's individualizing. And they're thinking about what those differences are. Let me give you a further example to come back to our skull D117. Here's where the different skulls, these are the different skulls, the 9 skulls. And remember, I was talking about groups of 3s. This is a multiple of 3. It's 9 skulls. In this particular case, there's 2 skulls that are found on one side and 7 that are found on the other side. So they're working it in such a way where it's in the same small room. It's a small room. On one end is 7 skulls. On the other end are 2 skulls. Interestingly enough, the 2 skulls are facing one direction. The 7 skulls are facing to the back of the other 2 skulls. I don't know why, but it's purposeful. It's not just chance. They're doing that for some reason. Here are the skulls. If you look closely at them, very quickly, you're going to say, yeah, this is all borscht. This is all red sauce pasta. But you're going to start to see differences. And I've used these boxes to highlight some of the differences. So the one in the upper right, one of these 9 has the mandible. Everybody else, the mandible's gone. There's no jaw. In some cases, they have shells that are being used, but they're using different shells for different skulls. You can see here, these are cowrie shells, and those are bivalves that are up there. So these are different as well. Some of them, they have the clay on the inside of the skull. In other ones, they don't. So there's variation with how they're doing these things and how they're putting them together. But then, even though these are being made differently, it's a matter that at that one event where they're all buried, they're all taking place at the same point. So this is like a potluck dinner of multiple families coming together. Instead of bringing their food so that everybody has some food on a particular day, maybe it's Sunday afternoon, and everybody is bringing their own pasta for this. Instead, what's occurring is probably every family is bringing their own skulls. You still know it's a skull, but it's done slightly differently. The last kind of thing I want to touch base on and sort of thinking about some of these pieces to this is really, why do this? And I think it comes back to both the individuals and the communities and the families. We haven't quite figured out what that relationship is. And I've been trying to think about it at points. I don't know which is more important. Is it the attracting attention to the individual? Is it attracting individual to the community? Is it to the household? Is it to the family? I don't know. I get confused. And some evenings I'll think it's got to be about the individual. And then just as quickly, it's going to be about the household or the community. What I will say is that I'm quite convinced that even if families are doing it, making their own pasta dishes, should we say, even though families are doing it, I think that there are people that are better at it than other family members. And so that there are specialists within the community that are doing this. Because it's not random. We know there's all these different steps. So this is the difference between having Gordon Ramsay make you the pasta dish you've always wanted versus somebody else. There's some people that are better at it. And ultimately, this is controlling knowledge. This is controlling memory. This is creating new memories within the community. So there's a lot of different things going on with this as you start thinking about the different pieces. How do we think about this in terms of identity? This is a fascinating question because as archaeologists, we usually don't ask the question of how do we create memory through different generations. We don't ask that question. This is helping us understand that they are creating memories. And here, let me explain how. At the start, we have a known individual who passes away. It's Uncle so-and-so who passes away. And then the individual is known, he's named, and after about 2 generations, defleshing has taken place. The average, I should mention, the average life expectancy for Neolithic people at this point is 33 years. So if you think of average life expectancy for people in other countries today, it's 70 plus years, depending on male or female, but it's a lot. It was about 33 years. So it's going to take generations to go through this process. So at some point, when they are starting to plaster the skulls, it's no longer, there are probably no longer people alive who knew the individual because too much time has taken place. So they don't have memories of the face of the living individual. There's no photographs on their iPhone to help them here. Instead, this is a remembered person. And that's slightly different. Here's the big difference. And this is how we create memory. And that is, there's 2 types of memory that are important here. One is known as experiential memory. You watch something take place. You are a witness to something taking place. So it's your experience. The other kind of memory we use is called referential memory. Referential memory is where somebody has told us something. Somebody has told us about a particular event or a particular person. And the argument I'm going to make is that if this is a pathway, if it takes 2 or 3 generations, where now you have a skull that's being made, and I'm going to make the argument that these skulls are not just made and put in the ground. I think what's occurring is that these skulls are sitting on the mantelpieces in the houses of individuals. These are sitting in the corners of rooms. These are being repainted, reused. These are the relics. These are the crosses. These are the relics of the saints. These are being used in the context of that they are brought out at certain points of time. But because of the fact that the individuals passed away a long time ago, nobody knows what their face looks like. It's a story about these individuals. So we have going from a named person to a symbolic person, and then ultimately, given that these are being buried in groups of 9 or so, these are symbolic collectives. That's very different, and that's something that helps us understand some of the very strange elements to these villages. Here's the other part to it. This is a photograph. Secondary mortuary practices like this one still exist in many areas of the world. Greece, multiple places in Africa, multiple places in the Pacific, where you have secondary mortuary practices. And we can think in terms of what do these do? What are the results of secondary mortuary practices? And that is, there's an increase in collective identity. People know they're a member of the community because they're seeing this on a regular basis. They also know that these stories are being passed along intergenerationally. So to younger people and passing along as you go. There's all kinds of other implications to it. The biggest one from my standpoint is that they're doing two things simultaneously. When you have these kinds of practices, or the skull removal from Jericho, it's doing two things at the same point. One is that it's making reference to the past. It's identifying these are ancestors from the past that we are related to, either directly or they were members of the community. So it's making reference to the past, but it's also making reference to the future. Because for this child, right here, who has his hands on the crania, it's quite likely he's probably a 10 to 12-year-old boy. He probably never knew this individual. He may be related to him, but he never knew that individual. And yet he knows that when it's his turn, he will be treated well. He will have the same mortuary practice because he will be treated well and he'll be cared for. So it's doing two of those things simultaneously. It's looking towards the future and it's looking to the past. That's the big story I wanted to give you in terms of thinking about how can we use some of these very specific examples to try and understand a very distant world, a very different world from what you're dealing with in some form. I very briefly wanted to conclude. In this context, it would be inappropriate not to, and that is, I want you to know that there's a lot of people that are outside of this country who recognize the kinds of hardship that you're going through. They are enormously sympathetic and supportive of what you are doing, not only for yourselves and your country, but also in terms of Europe and hopefully the rest of the world as well. So that there is that recognition of the kinds of very important things you are doing as a group of individuals, even if that letter T kind of makes it difficult to recognize that message in these complicated moments. And I think hopefully people will start to understand outside of your country that this is a conflict related to culture. It's a conflict that's related to heritage, to history, and to the sort of reshaping of identity and memory in some form. And so we just wanted to basically to lend our support towards you so that you understand, especially in these difficult days, to be able to get into this, to get into Ukraine in these kinds of days as a North American in some form. We just wanted to express our support and sympathy towards all of you. So thank you very much. I'd be happy to answer questions if you wish. If not, thank you very much for your time.
And are skeletons found like and their results? Do they do something for the skull instead of the skull to the skeleton?
Could you ask the question again in Ukrainian?
Okay. Pavlo Shidlovsky tells that English is second language in our university, so everybody should understand. Я запитала про те, що чи знаходять скелети ось ці без голови, і чи кладуть вони, ну, чи є знахідки, що щось кладуть на місце голови, чи залишається взагалі скелет без голови в цих випадках?
You're asking about the skulls and the scalp as in.
No, like the skeleton, and they take the skull from the skeleton, do they put something instead of it?
So that's a very good question. So the skeletons are underneath the floor of the house. You're sleeping on top of your relatives. That's a great thing. Now, I know, okay, so maybe it might be a smelly thing, but it probably is something that everybody got used to. So they're underneath the floor of the houses. And what they would do is they'd dig a hole, then they put the body in there. And then what they would do is they would patch the floor with new clay. And then they would put a stone right over where the crania was. In some cases, the floor color was white, and they would put red paint right above the skull. In other cases, the floor was all red, and they would put a white blob of paint. So they are marking, they're putting an X. They're putting an X right on the floor so people know where the skulls are. And I would bet, as it takes 10 years for defleshing to take place, I would bet everybody knows who's there, who's there, who's there. They may be even saying, this is Pavlo's corner. This is so-and-so's corner. They may even be sort of organizing space that way. When they come back, to come back to your question, what they would do is they would go and look for the red dot. They would open it up, open up just a small hole. In you go, dust it off. Out comes the crania. You put the dirt back there, and now you don't bother to put a mark there. Nothing. Nothing. So they're creating a map on the floor of genealogy. They're creating this map so you know where different people are buried. It's brilliant.
Are they found? Do they throw them to one place or just like rubbish?
No. What's interesting is in some cases, the mandible is still in the grave. In other cases, everything is gone. They're probably doing something different with the mandibles too, because in some sites, for example, there's one in southern Jordan where in doing excavations, they found a pit under a house and there were 9 mandibles. No skulls, no bodies, but 9 mandibles. I don't know, these were the really hungry relatives that you invited for dinner or something, I don't know. So and we have other examples of, in one case, 3 big bones from a cow where they have 3 lines that are etched around it. This is 10,000 years ago. These are bright, bright people doing amazing things. Other questions for anybody? Yes, please.
Did I get you right that after plastering the skull, they did not rebury it? They left it on display, like an icon or bones of monks modern Greece. So where is it? Put it in their own houses or?
Okay, another excellent question. So the question was that of how were these used as relics and put on display? It's hard to tell because, of course, if you have your grandmother's teapot and that goes on to the mantelpiece, eventually the bottom of the teapot is going to have some abrasion, but the top of it probably won't. What we find is that in some of the skulls, there's abrasion down below. And some of the plaster has been worn off, as if you're taking it, if I could borrow your phone for a second, as if you're taking this and rubbing it as you're putting it there. Now, the other part to it is that there's one that the reason why I think they're being used as relics is that there's a very famous site in Turkey called Çayenu. And in Çayenu, when they did excavations there, they excavated lots and lots of houses, but then they found a series of buildings that were not being used as residence. And one of these buildings had 400 skulls. 400. That's not 9. That's nothing else. That's a library. I think that is a body library, a skull library. Now, I don't know if who gives permission to take this as like a book and take the book out for a week and then bring the book back. But I think these were working like a library where people were both as a memorial, but also probably as a library where people are taking the skulls out. I don't know. I know it's crazy. Okay. Did that answer your question? Okay, of course.
So, first one, why do you think that people were waiting for 10 years to remove heads from these bodies? Would they remove it right after death and something like that, and then make these clay faces? And second question is, would these people were killed as a part of the ritual?
Yeah. Part as a ritual? Yeah. Okay, so the first question, the question was one of why wait 10 years? And I think it's a simple explanation. If you want to remove the mandible and the back here, you need to use a knife, a piece of flint, and you have to cut. There's some rare examples where you find cut marks right here where they're removing it. But those are very rare. So my sense is they're letting the insects do their job. They're letting the insects do the job. It's cleaner, it's easier. I wouldn't want to go remove the crania of my uncle or aunt. Yeah, that's kind of messy. I think they would just let the insects do their job. Now, there's some other cases where maybe, I don't know, it's been 10 years and there's still some flesh. Maybe there you have to saw a little bit or something. But I think for the most part, they're letting time do the work. The second question you asked, remind me again, if you would. Yeah. A number of years ago, there was a very famous researcher by the name of Jacques Cauvin, who made, different researcher, different French researcher, Alain Testard. And he made the argument that these were trophies, that these were the skulls of people, the enemy. And that these were the individuals who were your enemy, and you would capture their skulls and you would feel better about yourself. I don't agree. And the reason why is you don't give so much love and attention to your enemies. And yet they are clearly giving love and attention to these individuals. They're keeping track of them. They're being good to them. So I don't think they're the enemies. I think they're family members. Now, I've been given instructions about what's supposed to take place at this point. Yeah, welcome to Kyiv. That was your line. Okay, very quickly, I think it is not related to ritual, but it's related to, or sacrifice. I think it's related to just natural death. Okay.